The wind off Lake Superior warned him first, but the town's laughter was louder. An old veteran in a thick red and black buffalo-plaid flannel jacket poured his last savings into a ridiculous cabin project in Duluth, Minnesota, laying a massive stone foundation so big the neighbors swore he'd lost his mind. But when the first savage blizzard hit and fireplaces across the valley started dying, his German shepherd began circling the floor vents, whining like it could smell heat trapped in the earth itself. Then, the unthinkable happened. While everyone else burned through their wood piles and still shivered, his little cabin stayed warm, even after the fire went out. And the moment the town realized why, pride cracked like ice, and one stubborn idea rewrote everyone's winter. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below, because it's always wild to see how far these winter legends travel. Autumn reached Duluth quietly, but the wind off Lake Superior arrived sharp and impatient, carrying the first warning of a winter that would not forgive mistakes. Walter Hayes felt it in his bones before he felt it on his skin. At 72, his body no longer lied to him. The cold settled into his knee, climbed his spine, and whispered reminders of nights, long past nights, spent awake in foreign winters, where warmth was rationed and survival depended on preparation, not hope. He stood alone on a narrow plot at the edge of town, sleeves rolled up beneath a thick red and black buffalo-plaid flannel jacket. The fabric faded but clean, the cuffs worn soft from decades of use. His hands were large-knuckled and scarred fingers bent slightly from old breaks that never healed quite right. A gray beard framed his face, trimmed short out of habit rather than vanity, revealing sharp cheekbones and a jaw that still carried the discipline of a soldier who had once been younger and angrier. Walter did not talk much. He never had. War had taught him that silence wasted less energy and revealed less weakness. The land beneath his boots was already torn open. A trench ran deep and wide where a small cabin was meant to stand far deeper than any reasonable foundation needed to be. Stone lay stacked in careful piles, sandstone, limestone, heavy pieces, chosen not for beauty, but for weight and density. To anyone passing by, it looked absurd, like a fortress being built for a man who lived alone. To Walter, it looked like insurance. Across the street, Harold Benson paused in his work, leaning on his axe handle. Harold was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered with a permanent stoop from years of logging his beard, a messy blonde tangle that made him look older than he was. He had survived Duluth winters his whole life and wore that fact like a badge. "You planning to build a castle?" "Walt," he called out, half laughing, half genuinely puzzled. "That hole's big enough to bury a truck." Walter didn't answer right away. He set another stone in place, adjusted it by feel, then finally glanced up. His eyes were pale blue, steady, unreadable. "Winter's coming early," he said simply. Harold snorted. "Winter always comes early here. You don't fight it with rocks. You fight it with wood." He gestured toward his own yard where cords of firewood were stacked higher than the fence. "That foundation's going to drink the heat right out of your cabin." Walter nodded once, as if acknowledging a statement that had nothing to do with him. Harold shook his head and returned to chopping, the sound of splitting logs echoing down the street like a rhythm everyone in the neighborhood understood. Shadow lay near the edge of the trench, his large German shepherd frame relaxed but alert. He was nearly 9 years old, his muzzle dusted with gray, his coat a rich mix of black and tan that gleamed even under the muted autumn light. His ears twitched constantly, tracking every sound, the axe, the wind, the distant gulls crying over the lake. Shadow had been with Walter since he was a pup, adopted from a shelter after Walter's retirement, when the house felt too quiet and the nights too long. The dog was calm, observant, rarely barking without reason. He watched the stones with the same seriousness Walter did, occasionally standing to sniff the cool earth, before settling again as if memorizing the ground. By mid-morning, more neighbors had noticed. Sarah Collins walked by on her way back from the corner store, slowing when she saw the foundation. Sarah was a tall, slender woman in her early 60s, with iron-gray hair pulled into a practical bun, her skin pale from a lifetime spent indoors, nursing others rather than herself. She had kind eyes, but a sharp mouth, the kind shaped by years of responsibility. She'd lost her husband to a heart attack 2 winters earlier, and understood cold in a different way, the kind that crept into quiet houses and stayed. "Walter," she said gently, pulling her coat tighter. "That's a lot of stone." He wiped his hands on a rag and offered a small, polite smile. "It needs to be." She hesitated, studying his face, the set of his shoulders, the calm determination that didn't match the scale of what he was doing. "Just don't wear yourself out," she said. "You can't outwork winter." Walter watched her walk away, her boots crunching softly over frost-hardened ground. He thought about all the times he'd been told something similar. "You can't outlast this. You can't hold that position. You can't keep everyone alive." Those words had followed him through snow and mud, through nights lit by flares and mornings that smelled of smoke and fear. He had learned then that any winter, was not beaten by strength alone. It was beaten by memory, by knowing what failed last time and refusing to repeat it. He returned to work without another word. As the days passed, the foundation grew. The trench reached bedrock 4 feet down, where the earth held a steady warmth even as the air sharpened. Walter built upward from there, stone rising above ground level, until it looked grotesquely tall compared to the modest cabin frame stacked nearby. People stopped to stare. Some laughed openly. Others shook their heads in quiet judgment. At the diner they called it Hayes's Folly. Someone joked that he was building a grave early so winter wouldn't have to do it for him. Walter heard the laughter. He always did. But it slid off him like snow off oiled canvas. Inside, his thoughts were elsewhere, back to frozen outposts where heat came from mass, not flame from thick walls that remembered yesterday's fire and gave it back slowly through the night. He could still feel the warmth of stone beneath his boots, in places most men had already forgotten, still smell the mix of smoke and earth that meant safety. Those memories were heavier than any stone he laid. At night, he sat on a folding chair beside the trench, drinking weak coffee, shadow pressed against his leg for warmth. The sky over Duluth turned hard and clear, stars sharp as glass. Wind rolled off Lake Superior in long, moaning gusts that rattled loose boards and crept under collars. Walter imagined January, imagined the sound of trees cracking from cold, imagined neighbors feeding fires every 2 hours and still shivering. He did not feel superior. He felt responsible to himself, to the quiet life he had chosen after decades of noise. One evening, as the sun sank early behind low clouds, a pickup slowed at the curb. Mark Jensen leaned out the window. Mark was a broad-faced man in his 40s with restless eyes and a habit of talking fast as if silence made him nervous. "You know," he said, trying to sound friendly, "you could have had the cabin up already if you'd skipped half that digging." Walter looked up, his breath visible. "Cabins are easy to build," he replied. "Living through winter is harder." Mark frowned, unsure whether to laugh or feel rebuked. He drove on without another word. Shadow stood, ears pricked, watching the truck disappear. Walter reached down and rested a hand on the dog's thick neck. "They'll see," he murmured, more to himself than to Shadow. Not in pride. In patience. By the time the first real snow fell, the foundation was complete, huge, solid, unmoving. The cabin frame beside it looked almost embarrassed by comparison. The neighborhood had made up its mind. The old veteran had finally lost whatever edge he once had. But as Walter stood back studying the stone now dusted white, he felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. Laughter was temporary. Winter was honest. And stone, if treated right, never forgot what it was given. Walter Hayes never argued, not because he lacked words, but because words had failed him long ago. The cold mornings in Duluth sharpened his memories, the way frost sharpens edges, bringing back nights when silence was not peaceful, but tactical, when warmth meant survival, and mistakes were paid for with lives. He worked steadily now, stacking stone with a methodical calm that came from years of assembling rifles by touch in pitch darkness, his movements precise, economical, almost reverent. Each stone he lifted carried weight not just in mass, but in meaning chosen carefully, for density, for how long it would hold heat once the fire kissed it, for how slowly it would give that heat back when the flames died. His thick red and black buffalo-plaid flannel jacket hung heavy on his frame, the shoulders broad but slightly sloped from age, the fabric smelling faintly of wood dust and iron. His face, weathered and deeply lined, held a permanent seriousness shaped by decades of command responsibility. Yet there was no bitterness in his expression, only a quiet resolve that unsettled those who mistook silence for weakness. Shadow followed him closely now, rising from his resting place whenever Walter moved, nails clicking softly on stone amber eyes, tracking every motion. The dog's body was still powerful despite his age, his back straight, his tail calm and deliberate, and when he pressed his head briefly against Walter's thigh, it was not for comfort, but for confirmation, as if acknowledging a shared purpose neither needed to explain. As the foundation rose higher, so did the murmurs. Men driving past slowed their trucks. Women walking home from work paused longer than necessary. There was something unsettling about watching an old man labor without complaint, without haste, without apology. Walter noticed it all, but kept his gaze on the stones. In his mind, he was no longer on the edge of Lake Superior, but standing guard on frozen ground, where wind cut through layers of clothing like knives, where heat came from mass, not flame, and fires were fed with discipline rather than desperation. He remembered an outpost where a poorly insulated shelter had lost heat within hours, forcing men to wake repeatedly through the night, to keep the fire alive, their exhaustion compounding their vulnerability. He remembered another place, older, built thick and low, where stone walls absorbed the day's heat and released it slowly through the night, allowing men to sleep, to think, to survive. That lesson had never left him. It had followed him home, tucked into the quiet corners of his retirement, like an old manual no one else bothered to read. One afternoon, as clouds rolled low and the light flattened into a dull gray, Thomas Reed appeared at the edge of the property. Thomas was new to the neighborhood, a man in his late 30s with a narrow face, close-cropped brown hair, and a perpetual crease between his brows that suggested he worried even when there was nothing urgent to worry about. He worked maintenance at the shipping docks and had moved to Duluth, chasing steadier work and cheaper rent. His posture still carrying the stiffness of someone unused to cold this deep. He stood with his hands in his pockets, watching Walter set another stone. "You really think that's going to help when it hits 20 below?" Thomas asked, his tone curious rather than mocking. Walter paused, resting his hands on the top of the wall, feeling the stone's chill seep into his palms. "I don't think," he said. "I know what happens when it doesn't." Thomas frowned slightly, processing that, then nodded once. He didn't argue. He didn't laugh. That alone earned him Walter's quiet respect. As days shortened, Walter's internal rhythm shifted. He woke earlier, slept lighter, his body responding to the approaching winter, the way it always had, preparing, before the threat fully arrived. At night, memories came uninvited. Faces blurred by time surfaced briefly. Voices carried on cold wind orders given and followed. He remembered the weight of responsibility more than the fear, the knowledge that if he misjudged conditions, others would suffer. That knowledge had shaped him more than any medal ever could. It had taught him to plan beyond what others saw, to prepare for the night, not the day. Sarah Collins stopped by one evening bringing a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. She stood near the foundation, her tall frame wrapped in a wool coat that hung loosely from her shoulders, her gray hair escaping its bun in wisps that caught the wind. "You've been working non-stop," she said, her voice firm but kind. "Even soldiers rest." Walter accepted the bread with a nod. "Winter doesn't," he replied. She studied him for a moment, her sharp eyes softening as she took in the lines around his mouth, the way his gaze drifted briefly to the horizon, as if measuring something invisible. "My husband used to say that," she said quietly. "He didn't plan for it either." Walter met her eyes, then understanding passing between them, without explanation. Loss, recognized loss. She left him with a small smile that carried no pity, only respect. As the foundation neared completion, Walter began shaping the space beneath where the cabin floor would eventually sit, envisioning airflow paths, imagining heat rolling slowly through stone, lingering where it was needed most. He spoke to Shadow while he worked, not in commands, but in low murmurs, grounding himself in the present. Shadow listened, tail thumping once now and then, a steady heartbeat against the quiet. The laughter from the neighborhood faded into background noise, replaced by something subtler, uncertainty. People no longer laughed every time they passed. Some watched in silence. Others asked questions they pretended were jokes. Walter recognized the shift. He had seen it before, that moment when confidence cracks and curiosity seeps in. It did not satisfy him. It simply confirmed what he already knew. One evening, as frost glazed the stones and breath fogged the air, Walter stepped back and looked at what he had built so far. The foundation stood massive and patient, a quiet promise embedded in earth and stone. He felt the familiar calm settle in his chest, the same calm he had felt before long nights on watch when preparation was complete, and all that remained was to endure. Shadow sat beside him, ears forward, eyes bright in the fading light. Winter had not yet arrived, but it was close now, and Walter felt ready. The stones beneath his hands would remember the fire when the time came. He was certain of that. December arrived without ceremony, only pressure, the kind that lowered the sky and tightened every breath in Duluth, until even sound seemed brittle. Snow did not fall gently. It came sideways, driven off Lake Superior in hard white sheets that erased streets and swallowed fences overnight. Temperatures sank below zero and stayed there, the cold settling in with the confidence of something that intended to remain. Walter Hayes felt the shift immediately, not as fear, but as confirmation. The cabin stood complete now, modest in size, its walls plain and unremarkable, atop the massive stone foundation that had become the neighborhood's quiet obsession. While others fed their fires with frantic urgency, Walter kept his burning low and steady, tending it the way he once tended men, never wasting energy, never letting panic dictate pace. Inside, the air felt different, thicker, calmer, carrying a warmth that did not bite at the edges. Shadow sprawled across the stone floor near the hearth, his long body stretched comfortably, paws twitching in sleep, his breath slow and even. The stone beneath him held heat like a living thing, radiating upward, steady and patient, as if answering a promise made weeks earlier. Outside, the laughter had vanished. In its place came the sound of axes striking wood long into the night, of doors opening and closing, every few hours, of boots crunching through snow, as neighbors took turns waking, to keep their fires alive. Harold Benson's house glowed orange at all hours, smoke pouring thick from the chimney, yet frost still crept along the inside corners of his windows. He looked older now, his broad shoulders slumped. His beard rhymed with ice when he stepped outside to split more wood. Across the street, Mark Jensen paced his small living room at night, restless and sharp-eyed, feeding his stove until his hands shook with exhaustion, his anxiety mounting with every hour the fire threatened to die. Sarah Collins wrapped herself in layers and slept upright in a chair near her hearth. Her tall frame, hunched gray hair loose around her face, the calm kindness in her eyes, replaced by a tight vigilance born of too many cold nights alone. They all noticed Walter's cabin. They noticed the absence of constant smoke, the lack of frantic movement, the way his windows never frosted over the way theirs did. The first to speak was Thomas Reed, who showed up one morning with red-rimmed eyes and stiff fingers, his narrow face drawn tight with fatigue. "You running your fire all night?" he asked, glancing inside. Walter shook his head, lifting the kettle from the hearth. "I let it rest," he said. Thomas frowned, stepping inside his shoulders, visibly relaxing as the warmth reached him. He knelt, pressed a hand to the stone floor, then to the foundation wall, his breath catching. "It's warm," he said quietly, as if afraid to break the spell. Word spread quickly after that, not in jokes, but in whispers. By the second week of December, concern replaced ridicule entirely. Pipes froze. Woodpiles shrank faster than planned. Sleep became a luxury no one could afford. One night a storm rolled in harder than any before. It whined, screaming down the street, with a force that rattled doors and made the houses groan. Temperatures plunged further cold, sharpening into something almost metallic. Around midnight, a knock came at Walter's door. He opened it to find Harold Benson standing there. His massive frame hunched, his beard stiff with ice, his bravado gone. "Can we warm up for a bit?" he asked, voice hoarse, pride stripped bare by necessity. Walter stepped aside without a word. Inside, Harold stared stunned at the calm warmth filling the room at shadow, lifting his head briefly before settling back down. How Harold asked the question raw. Walter poured him coffee, the steam rising lazily. "Stone remembers," he said. Harold laughed once weakly, then sat heavily rubbing his hands together. Others came after that. Mark Jensen, restless and pale, his usual rapid speech slowed to careful questions. Sarah Collins, quiet and composed, her skin flushed with relief as warmth reached her long frozen fingers. Even a few faces Walter did not know well appeared at the door, their expressions stripped of judgment, replaced by something closer to awe. Walter did not lecture. He did not gloat. He answered questions when asked simply, directly, his voice steady. Inside he felt something ease, a tension. He hadn't realized he carried the knowledge that he had prepared correctly, that his instincts shaped by years of bitter experience had not failed him. He slept through the nights now, long and uninterrupted, waking to a cabin that held its warmth even when the fire had burned low. Shadow followed him as always, content, his coat glossy in the firelight, his tail thumping softly against the stone when visitors arrived. Outside, the neighborhood changed its rhythm. Fires burned hotter longer. Wood disappeared. Faces grew hollow. Conversations shifted from mocking commentary to anxious calculation. How much wood left? How many nights like this could they endure? When would the cold break? Each morning, Walter stepped outside, the crunch of snow loud beneath his boots, the air sharp in his lungs, and felt the quiet weight of eyes watching from frosted windows. The foundation beneath him felt solid, reassuring the way firm ground feels beneath a soldier's boots after days of uncertainty. One evening, as the storm finally eased into a sullen, bitter calm, Sarah stood beside him at the doorway, watching the street. You were ready, she said softly. Walter nodded. Winter always comes, he replied. People forget. She studied him. Really studied him, the set of his jaw, the calm focus in his eyes, and smiled faintly. They won't forget this, she said. Walter looked back into the cabin at the stone walls glowing faintly with stored heat at shadow sleeping soundly, and felt the rare comfort of knowing that something he had built would outlast the laughter, the fear, and the storm itself. Outside, Duluth shivered. Inside, the stone gave back what it had been given, and the town began to understand that winter had already chosen its lesson. The cold that night did not creep in, it struck. The thermometer outside beside the corner store bottomed out before dawn, the red line sinking past numbers most people avoided saying aloud. Wind tore down from Lake Superior in long, punishing gusts, rattling windows, forcing snow into every crack it could find. Even houses that had survived decades of Duluth winters groaned under the pressure. Inside those homes, fires roared without rest, consuming wood at a frightening pace. Yet warmth clung only to the space closest to the hearth. Corners froze. Walls sweated frost. Breath turned white indoors. By midnight, panic replaced routine. Doors opened and shut as families huddled together, calculating risks in low voices. Some made the decision no one wanted to make. They left. Wrapped in coats and blankets, boots slipping on ice, they moved through the storm toward the only place on the street that seemed untouched by desperation. Walter Hayes heard the first knock while washing his mug. It was a slow, heavy sound, hesitant but urgent. When he opened the door, the wind tried to force its way in, carrying with it Harold Benson, his face gray beneath his ice-crusted beard, eyes wide with something close to fear. Behind him stood Mark Jensen, jaw-tight, shoulders shaking from cold and exhaustion, and Sarah Collins, tall even when hunched against the wind, her pale face drawn gray hair escaping its pins and whipping wildly. Walter stepped aside without question. Inside the cabin held steady warmth, the air calm and dense, untouched by the chaos outside. The hearth had burned low hours earlier, reduced to embers, yet the stone beneath the floor radiated a deep, enveloping heat that filled the room evenly. Shadow lifted his head, ears flicking once, then stood to greet them, tail wagging slowly, his body loose and unbothered, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Sarah was the first to notice. She removed her gloves, fingers trembling, and pressed her palm to the stone wall. She inhaled sharply, then laughed softly, a sound halfway between disbelief and relief. "It's warm," she whispered, as though afraid the warmth might hear her and disappear. Harold followed, placing both hands flat against the foundation, his massive shoulders sagging as heat seeped into his stiff joints. "The fire's out," he said, almost accusingly scanning the hearth. Walter nodded. "Has been for hours." Mark crouched, touching the floor, his restless energy stilled for the first time since Walter had known him. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, but there was no anger in his voice now, only awe. More knocks followed. Thomas Reed arrived with two neighbors. Walter barely recognized an older couple from down the block, their faces pinched with cold eyes, shining with unshed tears. Walter let them in, poured water, made space. No one spoke much at first. The warmth did the talking. People shed layers instinctively, shoulders dropping, breathing, slowing, as bodies remembered what safety felt like. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, the stone answered with silence and heat. Someone asked how long the fire had been out. Someone else asked how thick the foundation was. Walter answered calmly without pride, explaining only what was necessary. He spoke of stone and massive patience and preparation of letting heat move slowly rather than forcing it. His voice was steady, carrying the authority of someone who had learned these lessons when mistakes were fatal. The neighbors listened the way soldiers listen quietly, fully, with the understanding that this knowledge mattered. At one point, Harold let out a shaky laugh. "We called it useless," he said, staring at the wall. "Cold weight." Walter met his eyes, not unkindly. "Stone isn't cold," he replied. "It just remembers longer than we do." Silence followed that, heavy and thoughtful. Outside, another house went dark as its fire failed. The sound of the wind seemed to falter briefly, as if even it was listening. People stayed until dawn. Some slept sitting up, others stretched out on blankets near the walls, warmth seeping into them slowly, deeply. Shadow lay among them, calm and watchful, moving only when someone shifted too close to the door, his presence grounding the room. Walter remained awake, not from worry, but habit, listening to the subtle creaks of stone expanding and contracting as it released its stored heat, the quiet language of materials doing exactly what they were meant to do. By morning, the storm broke into a bitter stillness. Frost coated the street like glass. The neighbors emerged from the cabin changed. Faces that had once carried easy judgment now held respect edged with humility. Harold lingered at the doorway, rubbing his hands together. "You saved us," he said, voice rough. Walter shook his head. "Winter did," he replied. "It just reminded you." Sarah paused beside him, her tall frame straight again, color returning to her skin. "You were right," she said simply. Walter watched them go, boots crunching over snow shoulders, squared against the cold, but no longer bowed by it. Inside, the cabin remained warm. The stone beneath Walter's feet still held heat, quiet and dependable. He knelt and rested his palm against it, feeling the slow pulse of stored warmth. Shadow pressed close, breathing steady. Outside, Duluth would remember this night. Inside, the stone had already spoken. Spring did not arrive with celebration in Duluth. It seeped in slowly, almost cautiously, as if the land itself needed reassurance after months of punishment. Snow retreated from sidewalks in dirty, stubborn patches, and the lake released a gray breath that smelled of thaw and old ice. Walter Hayes noticed the change the way he noticed everything else, not with excitement, but with attention. Each morning he stepped outside in his worn boots, the red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, hanging familiar and heavy on his shoulders, and listened to the sound of meltwater threading through stone. Shadow walked beside him, older now in the sunlight than he had looked all winter. His thick German shepherd coat shedding in clumps, his gait steady, purposeful, as if winter had merely been a long patrol they had finally completed. The neighborhood looked different too. Firewood stacks stood half-emptied and crooked. Chimneys that had smoked relentlessly all winter now rested silent. Faces that once carried easy confidence bore the quiet humility of people who had learned something the hard way. The laughter that had followed Walter's foundation was gone, replaced by a thoughtful hush. People stopped him on the street now, not to mock, but to ask. They carried notebooks, folded papers, rough sketches. Harold Benson was among the first. He approached one afternoon, hat in hand, his broad shoulders relaxed for the first time in months. His beard, once wild and ice-stiffened, was trimmed short, now revealing a face weathered but earnest. "I've been thinking about what you said," he admitted, eyes dropping briefly to the stone foundation, visible beneath Walter's cabin. About stone remembering. Walter listened without interrupting, the habit of command still guiding his posture. Harold continued explaining how he'd woken fewer times toward the end of winter, how exhaustion had made him reckless, how close he'd come to letting his fire die one night. That near miss had changed something in him. Walter nodded once. Preparation gives you margin, he said. Margin saves lives. Others followed. Mark Jensen arrived with pages filled with cramped handwriting, his restless energy redirected into careful questions. His narrow face looked healthier now, the crease between his brows, softened by sleep, finally regained. He asked about depth, about airflow, about stone types. Thomas Reed came too quieter than before, his initial skepticism replaced by methodical curiosity. He listened more than he spoke, his maintenance worker's mind turning concepts into systems he could understand. Sarah Collins approached last, not with questions, but with a simple acknowledgement. She stood tall in the weak spring sun, her gray hair cropped shorter now, her pale skin touched with color. "You changed the way this street thinks," she said. Walter shook his head gently. "Winter did," he replied again, but he accepted her gratitude with a small nod, understanding that pride like cold could be dangerous if left unchecked. As the weeks passed, small changes spread. Foundations were inspected. Crawl spaces were reconsidered. Conversations shifted from how much wood to cut to how to make heat last longer. Walter shared what he knew when asked, never pushing, never preaching. He explained mass and patience, spoke of letting materials do what they were meant to do instead of forcing them into quick answers. He spoke of lessons learned in places where comfort was rare and consequences were final, though he rarely named those places directly. His eyes sometimes drifted when he talked, not in nostalgia, but in measurement, as if comparing past winters to this one, checking assumptions against reality. Shadow remained at his side through it all, his presence a steady constant. Children who had once been warned to stay away from Walter's crazy stone house now approached cautiously to pet the dog, marveling at his calm demeanor. Shadow accepted the attention with quiet dignity, his amber eyes alert, his loyalty unquestioned. Walter watched these moments with something close to contentment. Not pride, he had seen too much of that, but a sense of alignment, of having acted in accordance with something older and sturdier than public opinion. One afternoon, as ice finally cleared from the foundation stones, Walter knelt and brushed away debris, feeling the surface, warm beneath his palm, despite the cool air. The stone had given everything it promised, and asked for nothing in return. He thought about the winter just past, about the night neighbors had crowded into his cabin, with fear in their eyes, about how quickly ridicule had turned into respect when comfort was at stake. He did not resent them. People forgot. He had forgotten things himself once and paid for it. Forgetting was human. Remembering, choosing to remember, was work. By late spring, life resumed its familiar pace. Boats returned to the lake. Shops reopened fully. Laughter returned, different now, tempered. Walter's routine did not change. He rose early, walked with Shadow, tended his cabin, spoke when spoken to. The foundation remained visible, unapologetic, a quiet testament to decisions made before evidence arrived. And when summer came, and talk turned to vacations and easy days, a few neighbors still glanced at the stone beneath Walter's home, already thinking ahead, already measuring the next winter differently. Walter noticed, and in that noticing, felt something settle and understanding, that the lesson had taken root. Not every idea mocked was foolish. Some were simply early, waiting for the right season to prove themselves. Duluth had learned that now the hard way, and the stone beneath Walter's cabin would remember it long after the snow fell again. In the end, this story was never really about stone or winter, or even survival. It was about something quieter and older, about how God often works through patience instead of spectacle, through wisdom instead of noise. What looked foolish to the crowd became shelter because it was built on understanding, humility, and preparation. The stone did not create a miracle on its own. It simply obeyed the laws God placed into the world long before any of us arrived. And when the cold came, those laws revealed their mercy. In everyday life, we face winters too. Seasons of doubt, hardship, loneliness, or fear, times when others may laugh at our choices, question our faith, or dismiss the quiet preparations we make in our hearts. But Scripture reminds us that wisdom often looks like foolishness to the world, and that faith is not proven in comfort, but in endurance. Sometimes God does not remove the storm. Sometimes He teaches us how to build before it arrives. So if you're watching this, and you feel like you're laying stones, no one understands, keep going. If you're choosing patience over panic, preparation over pride, faith over applause, trust that God sees it. The warmth will come when it's needed most. If this story spoke to you, you'd take a moment to share it with someone who might be facing their own winter. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from and what season of life you're walking through right now. We read every single one. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel so you don't miss more stories that remind us where true strength comes from. May God bless you, protect your home, steady your heart, and keep His warmth with you through every season. Amen.